We begin, as we so often do, with a cruelty dressed up as common sense. Thaddeus Calloway had lost his cooperage, his tools, and the small clapboard house his father built with his own hands, all because a man named Judge Rourke Bellamy decided that debts owed to him mattered more than the 12 years Thad had spent paying them. When the auctioneer's gavel fell on the last of his life's work, Thad walked away from Millbrook Landing with $14 in a tobacco tin and nowhere left to sleep. It was with those $14 that he did something the whole town would later call foolish, then unforgettable. He bought the old abandoned Icehouse down by the river, a sagging, forgotten structure nobody had touched in 20 years, for the price of $11 and a promise to clear the taxes owed on it. Men laughed behind their hands. Women shook their heads with pity. But none of them knew that sealed beneath that crumbling floor of sawdust and old ice was something that would not only change the life of one broken man, but would restore an entire town to what it had once been and had long forgotten how to be. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Thaddeus Calloway. If you find comfort in stories where quiet people are tested and yet do not break, we invite you to stay with us a while, and to let us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Thaddeus Calloway had been born in 1841 in a river-bottom cabin outside Millbrook Landing, Missouri, in a spring so wet that his mother always said the Mississippi itself seemed to be leaning in close to see the new arrival. His father, Josiah Calloway, was a cooper by trade, a broad, quiet man who spoke to barrel staves the way other men spoke to horses, coaxing them into shape rather than forcing them. And it was from his father that young Thad learned patience was not the absence of urgency, but the mastery of it. Josiah used to say that a barrel built in anger would leak by autumn, and a man built the same way would do worse. Thad's mother, Naomi, kept a kitchen garden that fed half the lane during hard winters and taught her son to read from a single water-stained Bible and a stack of almanacs, insisting that a man who could read the world around him would never truly be poor, whatever his pocket held. The town itself, in those years, was a modest but proud river settlement, its wharf busy with steamboats hauling grain and lumber, its main street lined with a dry goods store, a smithy, a small Methodist chapel, and the beginnings of what would become the Millbrook Mutual Aid Society, a cooperative fund that the townsfolk themselves had built, penny by penny, to catch families when illness or flood or fire knocked them down. Thad grew up watching his neighbors help one another not out of obligation, but out of a shared understanding that the river gave generously in good years and took cruelly in bad ones, and that no family stood entirely alone. It was a lesson he carried in his chest like a coal, warm and steady, long after the rest of his childhood had burned away. He apprenticed under his father from the age of 9, learning to read the grain of white oak, to steam and bend staves without splitting them, to fit a barrel so tight it could hold whiskey for 20 years without losing a drop. By the time he was 20, Josiah's hands had grown too stiff for the trade, and Thad took over the cooperage entirely, expanding it into a small but respected business that supplied barrels to farmers, distillers, and the steamboat trade up and down that stretch of the river. He married a schoolteacher named Sarah Whitfield in 1863, in the middle of a war that never quite reached their town, but hollowed it out all the same, taking sons and brothers to fight for causes that felt, from the riverbank, both enormous and impossibly far away. Sarah gave him 2 children, a daughter named Ruth and a son named Caleb, and for a time, Thad believed his life had settled into the shape his father had always hoped for him: steady work, a full table, a wife who read poetry aloud by lamplight, and a community that looked out for its own. It was Sarah who first noticed the changes in Rourke Bellamy, a man who had arrived in Millbrook Landing not long after the war ended, buying up river frontage and grain contracts with a confidence that seemed, at first, like ambition, and only later revealed itself as appetite. Bellamy became a judge through connections rather than merit, appointed to preside over county matters with a gavel that fell, more often than not, in favor of whoever owed him the least or paid him the most. He was a tall, silver-templed man with a voice like a closing door, and he had a particular talent for smiling at a man while quietly arranging his ruin. Thad's father had warned him, before he died in 1871, to be careful extending credit to Bellamy's grain operation, But the cooperage needed the contracts, and Thad, ever his father's son in patience, but perhaps too trusting in decency, believed a signed agreement meant what it said. The panic of 1873 arrived like a flood with no warning bend in the river to announce it. Banks failed across the country, credit dried up overnight, and Millbrook Landing's steamboat trade collapsed along with 100 others like it. Bellamy, who by then held paper on half the town's small businesses, including the cooperage, did not fail. Somehow, impossibly, he thrived, buying up ruined properties at auction for pennies while claiming publicly that he, too, had suffered terrible losses. Thad would not learn the truth of that claim for another decade, not until the secret beneath the Icehouse floor finally spoke for itself. For now, all he knew was that the note on his cooperage, extended in good faith 3 years earlier, was suddenly called due in full, with an interest calculation that seemed to grow larger each time Bellamy's clerk read it aloud in the courthouse. Thad fought it as best a decent man could fight a rigged game. He sold off his tools one by one, then his father's workbench, then finally the cooperage building itself, watching strangers carry away the staves and hoops that had built his family's whole life, piece by piece, like a body being taken apart in public. Sarah had died of a fever 2 winters before, a mercy in some ways. Thad sometimes thought bitterly that she did not live to see this. Ruth had married a farmer's son and moved west to Kansas the year prior, writing hopeful letters about sod houses and open sky. Caleb, only 16, had taken work on a steamboat, sending home what little he could, though Thad refused to touch a cent of it, unwilling to let his son's sacrifice pay for his own failure. By the time the gavel fell on the last of it, the house included, Thad Calloway stood on the wharf with a tobacco tin holding $14, the clothes on his back, his father's worn Bible, and nothing else in the world to call his own. It was old Silas Pruitt, the ferryman, who first mentioned the Icehouse, more out of pity than practicality, as Thad sat on an overturned crate near the landing that evening, staring at the river the way a man stares at something that has taken everything from him and yet somehow still looks beautiful. County's been trying to unload that old Icehouse of Ebenezer Kirchner's for 2 years now, Silas said, spitting tobacco into the current. Taxes owed on it are next to nothing. Building's falling in on itself, mind you. Roof's half gone. But it's shelter, and it's yours if you want it. Kirchner's people never came to claim it after he died. Thad almost laughed at the absurdity of it, a homeless cooper considering an ancient, abandoned icehouse as his next investment. But something in him, some quiet stubbornness inherited from his father, refused to let him simply lie down. He walked the half-mile downriver that same evening, his boots sucking in the mud, and stood before the structure that would change everything. The Icehouse belonged to a German immigrant named Ebenezer Kirchner, who had built it in the 1840s, decades before Thad was even born, back when the ice trade along that stretch of the Mississippi was a serious business, when men cut great blocks from the frozen river each winter and packed them in sawdust to sell through the sweltering months to butchers, breweries, and households too proud to go without. Kirchner had been, by every account Thad could later gather, an eccentric but deeply respected man, a founding member of the very mutual aid society that Thad's own parents had helped build, a man who believed, in his own quiet German way, that a community was only as strong as its willingness to protect its weakest members. He had died alone in 1858, with no children and distant relatives who never bothered to claim his modest estate, and the Icehouse had simply been left to rot, its ice trade made obsolete by newer, larger operations upriver, its walls sinking slowly into the mud, its roof caving in one storm at a time. Thad bought it 3 days later for $11, using nearly all he had left, and promising the county clerk he would settle the remaining back taxes, some $4 and change, within the season. The clerk, a thin man named Otis Grom, did not bother hiding his amusement. "You're buying a hole in the ground with a roof falling into it," he said, sliding the deed across the counter. "Man could freeze to death in there this winter, or drown when the spring flood comes through. But it's yours now, Mr. Calloway, for whatever that's worth." Word traveled fast in a town that size, and by the following Sunday, half the congregation at the Methodist chapel was whispering behind their hymnals about poor, broken Thad Calloway, who had lost his cooperage to Judge Bellamy and had now, in what could only be a symptom of grief, thrown away the last of his money on an ice cutter's ruin nobody else would touch. Thad did not much care what they whispered. He had nowhere else to sleep, and so, on a gray afternoon in late October of 1874, he pushed open the Icehouse's warped, half-rotted door and stepped inside for the first time as its owner, carrying nothing but a lantern he'd borrowed from Silas Pruitt and the last of his father's tools, a single hand adze and a mallet he'd refused to sell no matter how desperate things became. The interior smelled of cold earth and old sawdust, decades of it, packed thick around the base of the walls where blocks of river ice had once been stored through the summer heat. Sunlight fell in broken shafts through the collapsed roof, illuminating dust that hung motionless in the still air, as though the whole building had simply been holding its breath since Ebenezer Kirchner's death, waiting for someone to finally walk back through that door. It took Thad the better part of 2 weeks simply to make the place livable, patching the roof with scavenged boards and rushes cut from the riverbank, building a crude but functional hearth from stones he hauled up from the shallows, and clearing out decades of rotted sawdust that had turned, in places, into a kind of dark, spongy earth. It was during this clearing, on a cold morning in early November, that his adze struck something that was not sawdust, not stone, not the packed clay floor he'd expected beneath it all, but wood, deliberately shaped wood, a full plank flooring hidden a full 2 feet beneath where any sensible man would have thought the icehouse floor to be. Curious now in a way that made him forget the ache in his back and the hollow feeling in his stomach, Thad worked through the afternoon clearing the area, and by dusk he had uncovered a trapdoor, iron-hinged and stubborn with rust, set flush into what appeared to be a second, older floor built long before the icehouse itself had been raised above it. He did not open it that first evening. Something in him, perhaps his father's old caution about barrels built in haste, told him to wait, to think, to not rush toward whatever lay beneath a door that someone had gone to such trouble to hide. He slept that night with his hand resting on the cold iron ring of the trapdoor's handle, as though guarding something he did not yet understand, and in the morning, with gray river light coming through the patched roof, he finally pulled it open. The space beneath was small, no larger than a root cellar, lined with fieldstone that had clearly been laid with great care decades earlier, dry despite its proximity to the river, and dominated by a single iron-banded strongbox resting on a wooden pallet, alongside a leather satchel that had somehow survived the decades with only minor decay to its stitching. Thad's hands trembled, not with greed, we should say clearly, for greed was never in his nature, but with the particular awe man feels when he understands he is touching something that time itself had tried to forget. Inside the satchel, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them remarkably well, were letters, dozens of them, written in a careful, old-fashioned German accented hand, along with a thick, leather-bound ledger whose spine cracked as Thad opened it for the first time in what must have been 16 years. The ledger belonged to Ebenezer Kirchner, and its pages told a story Thad had never heard, though pieces of it, he would soon realize, had been circling the edges of Millbrook Landing's collective memory for decades without anyone quite putting them together. Kirchner had not simply been an ice cutter. He had been, for the final 10 years of his life, the appointed treasurer of the Millbrook Mutual Aid Society, the very cooperative fund that Thad's own parents had helped build, the fund that was meant to catch families when flood or fever or fire struck them down. And according to the careful, methodical entries in Kirchner's hand, entries that continued right up until the weeks before his death in 1858, the society had, at that time, accumulated a substantial reserve, nearly $3,000, an enormous sum for a river town that size in those years, money that had simply vanished from every public record after Kirchner's passing, with the society itself quietly dissolving not long after, its remaining leadership claiming, vaguely and without documentation, that hard times had drained the coffers dry. Thad sat in the cold stone cellar for a long time that morning, the ledger open on his knees, piecing together what his mind at first refused to fully accept. Kirchner, it seemed, had grown suspicious in his final year of a young clerk who had been hired to help manage the society's paperwork, a clerk whose name appeared with increasing frequency in the ledger's margins, always in connection with missing receipts, unexplained withdrawals, and loans made to outside parties that never appeared to be repaid. The clerk's name, written in Kirchner's own careful hand on the ledger's second-to-last page, dated only weeks before his death, was Rourke Bellamy. The letters in the satchel confirmed what the ledger only implied. Kirchner had written to a trusted friend and fellow society board member, a farmer named Absalom Dietz, explaining that he intended to bring formal charges against young Bellamy at the society's next meeting, that he had gathered sufficient proof of embezzlement, and that he had, out of an old ice cutter's caution, moved the society's remaining reserve, along with all his evidence, to a place Bellamy would never think to look, sealed beneath the floor of his own icehouse, until such time as he could present it properly before witnesses he trusted. Kirchner died 3 weeks later, quite suddenly, of what the town doctor at the time recorded only as a weakness of the heart, and Absalom Dietz, the one man who might have known where to look, had himself died in a river accident less than a year afterward, taking whatever he knew to the bottom of the Mississippi with him. Bellamy, meanwhile, young and unproven, had simply left Millbrook Landing for several years, only to return in the late 1860s a wealthy man, buying up river frontage and grain contracts, eventually appointed judge, and slowly, patiently, tightening his grip on the very town that had once nearly caught him in the act of robbing its most vulnerable families. Thad closed the ledger slowly, his hands no longer trembling with awe, but with something colder, harder, a fury he had not allowed himself to feel even when Bellamy's gavel had fallen on his cooperage. He understood now, with the terrible clarity of a man finally seeing the whole shape of a wound he had only felt in pieces, that the very panic that ruined him in 1873, the very system that let Bellamy buy up half the town's ruined businesses while claiming his own losses, was simply the second act of a play that had begun decades earlier in this same cellar, with the theft of money meant to protect families exactly like his own. And he understood, too, sitting there in the cold stone room with $3,000 in gold and silver certificates resting in an iron strongbox beside him, that this discovery was not simply his fortune. It was, in the truest sense, a debt finally come due. It would have been easy, we should say, for a lesser man to have simply taken that money quietly, to have paid off his own debts, bought back the cooperage, and disappeared from Millbrook Landing's judgment forever, and no one watching from outside would have blamed him for it, given everything he had lost. But Thad Calloway had been raised by a father who believed a barrel built for one man's convenience would eventually leak on everyone downstream from it. And he understood, with a certainty that settled into his chest like a keel finding true water, that this money had never belonged to him alone. It belonged to Millbrook Landing itself, to every family whose grandparents had paid their pennies into that cooperative trust, believing it would be there when they needed it most. He spent the following weeks moving carefully, methodically, in the manner his father had taught him to fit a stave, consulting first with Otis Grum, the county clerk, not as a man seeking favor, but as a man seeking the proper legal channel to have Kirchner's ledger and letters formally examined and authenticated. He sought out Reverend Amos Tillman, the aging Methodist minister who had baptized half the town and who, Thad knew, still remembered the old mutual aid society from his own boyhood, remembered the families it had saved, remembered, too, the quiet way its dissolution had been explained away without ever quite making sense. He found Grum's cousin, a schoolteacher who had studied law before deciding the classroom suited her better, and asked her to help him understand exactly what legal standing a 16-year-old ledger might carry in a courtroom presided over by the very man it accused. Word reached Rourke Bellamy, of course, faster than Thad would have liked, for Millbrook Landing was the kind of town where secrets traveled the wharf before they ever reached the church steps. Bellamy came to the Icehouse himself on a cold December evening, his fine wool coat entirely wrong for the humble surroundings, his smile as smooth and closed as ever, though Thad noted, with some quiet satisfaction, a tightness around the man's eyes that had not been there before. "I hear you found some old papers," Bellamy said, standing just inside the patched doorway as though unwilling to fully commit himself to the room. Kirchner's ramblings, most likely. The man was known to be strange in his final years. "I'd be careful, Calloway," about the trouble a man can bring on himself, chasing ghosts that can't defend their own reputations. It was, Thad understood immediately, both a warning and a confession, the kind only a guilty man delivers, certain of his own power right up until the moment it finally slips. Strange men keep careful ledgers, Thad answered quietly, his father's old patience steadying his voice even as his heart pounded. And dead men's handwriting doesn't lie the way living ones sometimes do, Judge. Bellamy's smile did not waver, but something behind it did, and he left without another word, though not before Thad noticed the man's eyes drift, almost involuntarily, toward the trapdoor still visible beneath the floorboards Thad had not yet fully replaced. The conflict that followed was not the kind fought with fists or firearms, though Thad would later admit there were nights he half expected Bellamy to send men to burn the Icehouse down around him. It was fought instead in the slower, colder currency of a small town's institutions, all of which Bellamy had spent a decade quietly bending to his will. He used his influence to delay the county's formal review of Kirchner's ledger, claiming procedural irregularities. He spread quiet word among the merchants who still owed him credit that any man seen assisting Thad Calloway might find his own arrangements suddenly less favorable. He even attempted, through an intermediary, to offer Thad a private settlement, a modest sum of cash in exchange for the ledger's quiet destruction, an offer Thad refused so firmly that the intermediary, a nervous young lawyer named Pruitt, left the Icehouse looking as though he'd been slapped. What Bellamy had not counted on, in all his careful maneuvering, was that Millbrook Landing's memory ran deeper than his decade of influence, and that the town's oldest families, the Dietses and the Kirchners' few remaining distant cousins and the Pruitts, and even old Reverend Tillman, still carried within them the story of what the Mutual Aid Society had once meant, a story that had simply been waiting, like the Icehouse itself, for someone patient enough to dig it back up. One by one, quietly at first, and then with growing confidence, they came forward, not to threaten Bellamy, for that was never Thad's intention, but simply to bear witness, to add their own fragments of memory to the ledger's careful accounting, until what had once seemed a single ruined man's desperate claim became, instead, an undeniable community reckoning. The formal hearing was held in February of 1875, in the same courthouse where Thad's cooperage had been auctioned away less than 2 years before, though Bellamy, recognizing at last the impossibility of presiding over evidence of his own guilt, had been quietly compelled to recuse himself, replaced by a circuit judge sent up from the county seat specifically for the matter. Thad stood before that courtroom not as a bitter man seeking revenge, but as his father's son, steady and unhurried, laying out Kirchner's ledger page by page, letter by letter, allowing the dead ice cutter's own careful handwriting to speak the accusation that 16 years of silence had never quite managed to bury. Reverend Tillman spoke of the society's founding purpose. Old Mrs. Dietz, Absalom's widow, spoke through tears of her husband's final worried letters home before his fatal accident on the river, letters she had kept but never fully understood until now. And when the circuit judge finally asked Rourke Bellamy directly whether he wished to respond to the ledger's accusations, the silver-templed man who had ruled Millbrook Landing's fortunes for a decade simply sat in silence, his smile gone entirely, understanding at last that a debt built in shadow always eventually comes due in daylight. The court's judgment did not, in the end, send Bellamy to prison, for the statute of limitations on the original theft had long since passed, and the law, slow as the river itself, could only do so much about a 16-year-old wound. But it did strip him of his judgeship, declaring him unfit to hold public trust, and it did compel him, through a civil judgment brought by the reconstituted Mutual Aid Society, to return a substantial portion of his accumulated wealth built, the court found, on foundations of manipulated debts and predatory contracts extended to families weakened by the very panic he had quietly profited from. Bellamy left Millbrook Landing within the month, moving downriver to a city large enough to swallow his shame among strangers who had never known him as anything but a wealthy gentleman, and the town, we should note, did not celebrate his departure with anger, but with the quiet, exhausted relief of people finally allowed to breathe freely again. Thad Calloway, for his part, did exactly what Ebenezer Kirchner's ghost, if such things exist, might have hoped a good man would do. He did not keep the $3,000 for himself, though the law would certainly have allowed him a considerable finder's claim upon it. Instead, working alongside Reverend Tillman and the reconstituted society's new board, he helped establish the fund exactly as Kirchner had originally intended it, a cooperative trust to catch families when illness or flood or fire struck them down, adding to it not only Kirchner's recovered reserve, but a portion of the judgment recovered from Bellamy himself, so that the very fortune built on the town's suffering became, at last, the town's protection against future suffering. He rebuilt his cooperage slowly, over the following 2 years, using his own 2 hands and his father's old ads, and he restored the Icehouse as well, not as a monument to what he'd found beneath it, but as a working icehouse once more, supplying the town through its hot summers exactly as Kirchner had, believing, as his father always had, that useful work honors the dead better than any statue could. And so we return, as we promised at the beginning, to that gray October afternoon when a broken cooper with $14 in a tobacco tin stood before a ruined icehouse that the whole town had already written off as worthless, and made the foolish, desperate decision to buy it anyway. We return to Thaddeus Calloway not because his story is unusual in its shape, for how many of us have stood, at some point, before something the world had already discarded, wondering whether there was any point in trying, but because his story reminds us of something the world seems determined to make us forget. That value does not always announce itself, that the things people mock us for choosing are sometimes exactly the things worth choosing, and that patience, the kind his father taught him over barrel staves decades earlier, is not weakness but the quiet, stubborn engine of every restoration worth having. Thad never once believed, standing in that cold stone cellar with Kirchner's ledger trembling in his hands, that he had found treasure. What he found, and what he chose to honor rather than keep, was a debt owed to people who had trusted a system to protect them, and in repaying it, he restored not only his own name, but the very fabric of trust that had once made Millbrook Landing a place worth calling home. Before we close tonight, we want to thank you, sincerely, for spending this time with us, for choosing a slow and quiet story in a world that so often rushes past exactly these kinds of tales. If Thaddeus Calloway's patience moved something in you tonight, we would be grateful if you shared this story with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things sometimes hold the greatest value, and that quiet resilience, in the end, so often outlasts the loudest cruelty. We'd love to know, in the comments below, about a time in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had written off, whether it was an old object, a forgotten place, or perhaps even a person. We read every one of your reflections, and they matter more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.